The knife was already at the rope when Elena understood what her father meant to do. She stood in the center of the great hall, her wrists bound in front of her, the fire in the stone hearth throwing long shadows across the floor. Her father would not look at her. Her mother stood behind him, silent, her hands pressed together as if in prayer, though no prayer would change what was about to happen. "You will go with them tonight," her father said. His voice did not shake. That was the part Elena could not forgive. "The debt is settled the moment you cross the border into Frostmoor land. I am your daughter." Elena's voice cracked on the last word. "Not a debt. You are both," he said, and turned away. Behind her, the messengers from Frostmoor waited without expression. 2 guards in gray cloaks, silent as stone, flanking a third figure who carried the papers that would make the trade final. Elena searched the room for someone, anyone who might object. She found no one. Even Corwin, the man who had once sworn to be her mate before the healers, confirmed what her body could not do, stood near the door, with his arms crossed, and his eyes fixed on the floor. "Corwin," she said his name like a question, like it might still mean something. He looked up at her then, just once. "You are broken, Elena. I cannot build a future on broken ground." He said it plainly, the way a man might comment on the weather, and something inside Elena went cold and still, like a lake freezing over in a single night. The healers had come 3 months earlier, 2 old women with sharp eyes and quiet hands, and they had examined her the way one might examine a horse before a long journey. When they finished, they did not speak to Elena at all. They spoke to her father, in low voices, and her father's face had gone gray and hard, and from that day forward, everything in Elena's life began to change in ways she could not stop. In the world she had been born into, a woman's worth was measured in one way above all others: her ability to carry the next generation of the pack. Strength mattered, loyalty mattered, kindness mattered, a little, but none of it mattered as much as the promise of children, of bloodlines continuing, of packs growing stronger through the next litter of pups born beneath a full moon. A woman who could not give that was not simply unlucky. She was a liability, a mistake waiting to be corrected. Elena had known this her whole life, the way one knows the sky is up and the earth is down, without ever having to think about it. She had simply never imagined it would be her. "Take her," her father said now, and the words landed in the room, like a stone dropped into still water. The guards stepped forward. One of them reached for the rope that bound her wrists, not unkindly, but firmly, the way a man handles cargo he has been paid to deliver without damage. Elena did not fight them. She had already learned, in 3 short months, that fighting changed nothing. It only made the humiliation last longer. As they led her toward the door, she looked back one final time. Her mother had not moved. Her father had already turned toward the fire, his back straight, his shoulders squared. A man who had done what needed to be done, and would not waste time regretting it. Corwin was gone. He had left the hall before she was even out the door, as if watching her leave might cost him something he could not afford to lose. Elena stepped out into the cold night air, and did not look back again. The journey to Frostmoor took 4 days. Elena rode in a plain wooden cart, her wrists still bound, though the rope had loosened enough that she could shift her weight without pain. The guards spoke little. When they did speak, it was to each other. Low words about weather and supplies and the road ahead, never to her. She was cargo, and cargo did not need conversation. She watched the land change as they traveled north. The gentle hills of her home gave way to steeper country, gray stone and dark pine, the air growing colder with every mile. By the 3rd day, frost coated the grass each morning, and Elena understood, without anyone telling her, that they had left her old life so far behind that turning back would not even be possible, even if someone came to change their mind. No one came. On the 4th day, the towers of Frostmoor Keep rose out of the mist ahead of them, tall and gray and unwelcoming, built into the side of a mountain, like something that had grown there rather than been constructed. Elena had heard stories about the Frostmoor pack her whole life. They were the strongest pack in the Northern Territories, ruled by an alpha king whose name was spoken with a mixture of respect and fear, Damien Frost. She had heard he was young. She had heard he was ruthless. She had heard, more than anything, that no one crossed him and lived to speak of it comfortably afterward. She had never imagined she would end up inside his walls. The cart rolled through the outer gate, past guards who barely glanced at her, and into a courtyard of packed dirt and gray stone. Elena was helped down, her bindings finally cut away, and a woman in a plain wool dress approached with a look on her face that was neither warm nor cruel, simply practical. "You're the trade from the south," the woman said. It was not a question. "Elena," she offered, because her name was the only thing she still had, that no one had taken from her. The woman studied her for a moment. "I'm Greta. I run the kitchens. You'll work under me starting tomorrow. Tonight you'll eat, you'll wash, and you'll sleep. Tomorrow, the real work begins." She turned and began walking, clearly expecting Elena to follow, and Elena did, because there was nothing else left to do. The servants' quarters were small and plain, a narrow bed, a chest for belongings she did not have, a single window that looked out over the eastern wall toward mountains she did not recognize. Elena sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after Greta left her there, staring at nothing, feeling the strange, hollow quiet of a life that had been completely emptied out, and would now have to be filled again with something new. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the 3 months since the healers came, enough tears to fill a lake, and there were none left in her tonight. Instead, she simply sat and breathed, and told herself the same thing she had been telling herself since the cart first left her father's land. "I am still here. Whatever they have taken from me, I am still here." The next morning came early, with Greta's firm knock on her door, before the sun had fully risen. The kitchens of Frostmoor were nothing like the quiet, empty life Elena had expected as a discarded and rejected woman. They were loud, busy, full of steam and heat and the clatter of pots, a dozen servants moving in practiced rhythms around each other, like dancers who had performed the same routine 1,000 times. Greta put a knife in Elena's hand and a pile of vegetables in front of her, and said only, "Cut them small. Uneven pieces cook uneven, and uneven food gets sent back, and food sent back means trouble for all of us." Then she walked away to shout at someone else, and Elena was left to figure out the rest on her own. It was hard work, harder than anything Elena had done in her sheltered life before the trade. Her hands blistered by midday. Her back ached from bending over the long wooden table, but there was something in the work that Elena had not expected to find. A strange kind of relief. No one in the kitchens knew about the healers, about the trade, about Corwin's cold words in the great hall. Here, she was only a pair of hands that could cut vegetables, and carry water, and scrub pots until they gleamed. For the first time in 3 months, no one looked at her like she was broken. By the end of the first week, Elena had learned the names of the other kitchen servants, learned which corridors led where, learned that the castle of Frostmoor was far larger and stranger than any home she had known before. She learned, too, from whispered conversations over wash basins and drying racks, that the Alpha King of Frostmoor was a subject of endless fascination among the staff. "He hasn't taken a mate," one of the younger servants, a girl named Marta, told her one evening as they scrubbed pots side by side. "Not once. Not even a companion. The council brings women to the castle constantly, daughters of every important family in the north, and he barely looks at them." "Why not?" Elena asked, more out of habit than real curiosity. In her old life, an alpha without a mate by his age would have been considered strange, even suspicious. Marta shrugged. "Some say he lost someone once, before he became alpha. Some say he simply doesn't care about tradition the way other alphas do. Some say he's waiting for something, though nobody knows what." She lowered her voice further, glancing toward the kitchen doors, as if the Alpha King himself might be listening. "He's fair, though. Strict but fair. He doesn't tolerate cruelty in his household. Not from nobles, not from guards, not from anyone." Elena filed this information away without much thought. The Alpha King, whoever he truly was, existed in a part of the castle she would likely never see. Her life now belonged to the kitchens, to Greta's sharp instructions, and the endless rhythm of meals prepared and served and cleared away. She told herself this was enough. She told herself she did not need more than this quiet, anonymous existence, safe from the judgment that had followed her out of her old home. But castles, Elena would soon learn, had a way of bringing people together who were never meant to meet. It happened on a night in her second week at Frostmoor, when a late council meeting ran long, and the kitchens received word that food needed to be sent up to the Alpha's private study before the servants could finally close down for the night. Greta, exhausted from the day's work, looked around the kitchen for anyone still awake enough to make the climb up the long stone stairs to the northern tower. Elena, she said, take the tray up. Third door on the left once you reach the top landing. Knock twice, leave it outside if no one answers, and come straight back down. Don't linger. Elena nodded, grateful for something to do that wasn't scrubbing the same pot for the fourth time that hour. She lifted the wooden tray, careful to keep the covered dishes balanced, and made her way out of the warm chaos of the kitchen and into the cold, quiet corridors of the castle proper. The climb to the northern tower took longer than she expected. The stairs wound upward in tight spirals, lit only by torches spaced far apart, and by the time Elena reached the top landing, her arms ached from holding the tray steady. She found the third door on the left, exactly as Greta had described, and lifted her hand to knock. Before her knuckles touched the wood, the door opened. Elena froze, the tray nearly slipping from her hands. Standing in the doorway was a man she had never seen before, tall, with dark hair, and eyes the color of a winter sky just before a storm. He wore simple dark clothing, nothing like the ceremonial finery she had imagined an Alpha King would wear, and there was an exhaustion in his face that made him look, for just a moment, less like a legend and more like a man who had been working too hard for too many hours. "You're not one of the usual servants," he said. It was not an accusation, simply an observation, spoken in a low, even voice. "No, sir." Elena's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm new. Greta sent me up with your food." He studied her for a long moment, longer than felt comfortable, though Elena forced herself to hold still under his gaze, rather than look away. There was something in the way he looked at her that felt different from the way people had looked at her since the healers came. He was not looking through her, the way her father had. He was not looking at her like a problem to be solved, the way Corwin had. He was simply looking at her, as if trying to understand something he could not quite name. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elena." She hesitated only a moment before adding, "My lord." Something flickered across his face, there, and gone so quickly, Elena almost thought she had imagined it. "You don't need to call me that," he said. "Not up here, this late, with cold food getting colder while we talk." A faint, tired smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Set it on the desk. Thank you for bringing it yourself, instead of leaving it at the door like everyone else does." Elena stepped past him into the study, very aware of how close he stood as she moved by. The room was lined with shelves of books and maps, a single lamp burning low on a large wooden desk covered in papers. She set the tray down carefully, arranging the dishes the way Greta had taught her, though her hands were not quite as steady as she wanted them to be. "Long meeting tonight?" she asked, before she could stop herself. It was not her place to ask him anything, and she braced for a sharp reply, the kind Corwin would have given her for speaking out of turn. Instead, he let out a short, tired laugh. "Longer than it needed to be. My council enjoys the sound of their own voices more than they enjoy solving problems." He glanced at her again, that same searching look. "You're not from around here. I would remember the accent." "I came from the south," Elena said carefully. "Recently." "Recently," he repeated, as if testing the word, as if he understood there was a story behind it, that she had no intention of sharing tonight, in this room, with a man whose name commanded fear across the entire northern territory. He did not push, he simply nodded, accepting the boundary she had drawn, without being asked to. "Thank you for the food, Elena," he said, and there was something in the way he said her name that made it feel different from every other time it had been spoken in the last 3 months, back when it had been used like an accusation, like a label for something broken. "Of course, my lord." She dipped her head and turned to leave, her heart beating faster than the short walk up the stairs should have caused. "Damien," he said quietly, just as she reached the door. She turned back, confused. "My name," he clarified, "since you told me yours." Elena did not know what to say to that. She simply nodded again, and slipped out into the cold corridor, closing the door softly behind her. She stood there for a moment, back against the stone wall, breathing carefully, trying to understand why her hands were shaking, why her heart had not yet slowed, why the memory of a pair of winter-gray eyes seemed to have lodged itself somewhere she could not easily dismiss. She told herself it meant nothing. Alphas were kind to servants sometimes. It was a small kindness, a brief conversation, nothing more. By the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, she had almost convinced herself of it. Almost. The following days returned to their usual rhythm. Elena worked in the kitchens, from dawn until well past dark, learning the recipes Greta favored, learning the particular tempers of the other cooks, learning to move through the crowded space without getting burned or bruised or stepped on. She did not see Damien again, not directly, though she heard his name spoken constantly throughout the castle, in tones ranging from reverence to quiet complaint, from the nobles who felt his refusal to choose a mate was a personal insult to their daughters. She told herself she was not listening for his name more closely than she should have been. She told herself the small flutter she felt each time someone mentioned the Alpha King was simply curiosity, nothing more, the natural interest anyone might feel about a powerful and mysterious figure living just beyond the walls of the world she now occupied. But late at night, lying in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, staring up at the dark ceiling, Elena found herself returning to that brief conversation in the northern tower, more often than she wanted to admit. The way he had looked at her, not through her. The way he had said her name, like it belonged to a whole person and not a broken one. She pushed the thought away each time. She had learned, in the hardest way possible, what happened to women who let themselves hope for things they were told they could not have. She had come to Frostmoor with nothing, and she intended to leave with her heart intact, whatever else happened. She would not make the mistake of hoping again, not for a man who was an Alpha King, not for a life that had no room in it for a woman the healers had already judged and found lacking. And yet, as the days passed, and the memory of those winter-gray eyes refused to fade, Elena began to suspect that hope, once it took root, was not so easily pulled out again. She did not yet know how right she was. The bowl shattered against the stone floor, before Elena even realized her hands had gone numb from carrying it too long. "Careful!" Greta's voice cut across the kitchen, sharp with the particular exhaustion of someone who had already broken up 3 arguments and burned 1 batch of bread that morning. "That's the 3rd dish this week. Are you sleeping at all, girl?" "I'm sorry," Elena said, already dropping to gather the pieces. "I'll pay for it out of my wages." "You don't have wages," Greta reminded her, not unkindly, crouching down to help. "You have a roof and food and a place that doesn't ask questions about where you came from. Don't waste it worrying over a bowl." She studied Elena's face for a moment, the dark circles beneath her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly even now. "Something's keeping you up at night." Elena did not answer right away. The truth was, several somethings had kept her awake most nights since her encounter with Damien in the northern tower 2 weeks earlier. The memory of his voice. The strange warmth in his eyes when he looked at her like a person instead of a problem. The absurdity of even thinking about him at all, given everything she knew about her own worth in the eyes of anyone who mattered in this world. "Just tired," Elena finally said. "New place. New work." Greta gave her a look that suggested she did not entirely believe this, but she let it go, rising and brushing off her apron. "Well, tired or not, the kitchens don't run themselves. Finish sweeping this up, and then help Marta with the bread for tomorrow's morning meal." Elena nodded and returned to her work, grateful for the distraction. It was not until 3 days later that she saw Damien again, and this time, there was no tray of food to give her an excuse for the encounter. She had been sent to the castle's inner courtyard to collect herbs from the small garden kept there for the kitchens, a task usually given to Marta, but which had fallen to Elena that morning, because Marta had twisted her ankle on the stairs. The garden sat in a quiet corner of the courtyard, sheltered by high stone walls, and Elena had just knelt to cut a handful of rosemary, when she heard footsteps approaching along the gravel path. She looked up to find Damien walking toward her, dressed for training rather than council meetings, a light layer of sweat still on his brow, his dark hair damp at the edges. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You've traded the kitchen for gardening," he said finally, a hint of humor in his voice. "Only for the morning." Elena rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her hands, suddenly very aware of how she must look. Plain servant's clothes, hair pulled back hastily, nothing at all like the polished noblewomen she imagined usually crossed his path. Marta hurt her ankle. "I'm filling in." "Ah." He glanced toward the herbs in her basket, then back to her face. "You have a talent for appearing exactly where I happen to be, Elena." Her cheeks warmed at the sound of her name in his voice again. "I could say the same about you, my lord." "Damien," he corrected, the same quiet insistence from their first meeting. "I told you that already." "I remember." She hesitated, unsure how much familiarity was appropriate between an alpha king and a kitchen servant with no family name left to speak of. It doesn't feel right, using it. Why not? Elena searched for an answer that would not reveal too much, that would not expose the careful walls she had built around herself since arriving at Frostmoor. Because you're the Alpha King, and I'm someone who cuts vegetables for a living now. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something she could not quite name. Titles don't tell you much about a person, he said. I've met plenty of nobles with important names who couldn't be trusted to hold a conversation worth having. And I've met exactly one kitchen servant in the last several months who speaks to me like I'm simply a man standing in a garden, rather than something to be managed or flattered. He tilted his head slightly. I find I prefer the second kind of conversation. Elena did not know how to respond to that. She busied herself instead with adjusting the basket on her arm, buying herself a moment to steady her thoughts. The council must keep you very busy, she said, changing the subject to safer ground. I hear them talking sometimes, when trays go up to the meeting hall. They seem to have a great many opinions about matters that don't concern them. Damien let out a short laugh, genuine this time, not the tired half-smile from their first meeting. You have no idea. This week alone, they've brought me 3 different proposals for potential mates, each one more insistent than the last, that the future of the pack depends entirely on which noble family I choose to align with. He shook his head, as if a mate were simply another treaty to be signed. Isn't that how it's usually done? Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. It was exactly how it had been done in her own family, exactly how her own worth had been measured and found wanting. It's how it's often done, Damien said, and something in his tone had gone quieter, more careful. I don't think it's how it should be done. A mate isn't a treaty. She isn't a bloodline to be secured, or a political advantage to be gained. She's meant to be a partner, someone you actually want beside you, not simply someone useful to have beside you. Elena looked at him for a long moment, surprised by the conviction in his voice. In her old life, no one had ever spoken about mates that way. Not her father, not Corwin, not anyone she had known. It had always been about usefulness, about strength, about the promise of children carrying the family name forward. To hear an Alpha King, of all people, speak so plainly against that tradition, left her unsettled, in a way she could not fully explain. That's not a common view, she said carefully. No, Damien agreed, it isn't, which is precisely why my counsel finds me so difficult to manage. He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes fully, chasing away some of the earlier exhaustion. I should let you finish your gardening before Greta comes looking for both of us. She would not be pleased to find her alpha distracting her kitchen staff, Elena said, a small smile of her own tugging at her mouth before she could stop it. Then I suppose I should go, before I get you in trouble. He held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary, before turning to leave, though he paused after only a few steps and looked back. Elena. Yes? I'm glad Marta hurt her ankle, he said, and there was something teasing in his voice now, something almost boyish, that did not match the fearsome reputation Elena had heard whispered throughout the castle since her arrival. Terrible thing to say, I know, but I am. He walked away before she could think of a response, leaving her standing alone in the garden, with a basket of herbs and a heart that refused to settle back into its usual steady rhythm. That night, Elena lay awake long after the rest of the servants' quarters had gone quiet, turning the conversation over and over in her mind. She told herself, as she had told herself after their first meeting, that it meant nothing. Kings were allowed to be friendly. Kings were allowed to disagree with their councils about matters of tradition. None of it changed the fundamental truth of her situation. She had been traded away like property, because her body could not do the one thing that mattered most in her world, and no amount of pleasant conversation in a garden could undo that fact. And yet, there had been something in the way he looked at her, something that felt less like polite curiosity and more like genuine interest, the kind she had not experienced from anyone since long before the healers arrived with their sharp eyes and quiet, damning conclusions. She was almost afraid of what that feeling might grow into if she allowed it room to breathe. Over the following weeks, their paths continued to cross, in ways that felt, at first, like simple coincidence. Damien would appear in the courtyard when Elena was sent to gather herbs. He would find reasons to walk through the kitchen corridors at hours when trays were being carried up to the meeting hall. Once, she found him waiting near the well where the servants drew water each morning, offering no explanation for his presence there, beyond a simple greeting and a question about how she was settling into life at Frostmoor. Elena was not foolish. She understood, even as she told herself otherwise, that these encounters were no longer accidental, and she began to notice, too, that she was no longer trying quite so hard to avoid them. Their conversations grew longer, more comfortable, filled with small observations that gradually became something deeper. Damien asked about her days in the kitchen, and actually listened to her answers, remembering details from one conversation to the next, in a way that surprised her every time. He told her, in careful pieces over several weeks, about his own life, the early loss of his parents, the sudden weight of leadership thrust upon him before he felt ready for it, the exhausting expectation from every direction that he marry quickly and produce heirs, to secure a future no one seemed interested in letting him choose for himself. Elena found herself sharing more than she intended to, though she remained careful never to speak directly of the trade, of the healers, of the reason she had left her old life behind. She spoke instead of small things, the recipes she was learning, the strange dry humor of a fellow kitchen servant named Owen, who kept the staff laughing, even during the busiest hours, the way the mountains looked at dawn from the small window of her room, so different from the gentle hills of her childhood. Word of these encounters did not stay contained within the walls of the courtyard and the corridors for long. Castles, Elena was quickly learning, held very few real secrets. Servants talked among themselves, and what servants noticed, nobles eventually heard, and what nobles heard, they discussed with sharp interest and sharper judgment. "You should be careful," Marta warned her one evening, as they folded linens together in the small storage room off the kitchen. "People are starting to talk about you and the Alpha." Elena's hands stilled over the fabric. "There's nothing to talk about. He's simply kind. It doesn't mean anything." Marta gave her a look that suggested she did not entirely believe this, much the same look Greta had given her weeks earlier. "Maybe not to you, but Lady Marisol has noticed, and she is not a woman who enjoys being overlooked." Elena had heard the name Marisol whispered through the castle before, always with a certain careful tone, the way one speaks about someone whose favor is valuable and whose displeasure is dangerous. Marisol was the daughter of one of the wealthiest allied pacts in the region, and rumor held that the council favored her above all other candidates as a future Luna for Frostmoor. Elena had never spoken to her directly, had only glimpsed her from a distance, a striking woman with dark red hair and an expression that suggested she was accustomed to getting what she wanted. "I have no interest in competing with anyone," Elena said carefully, resuming her work with the linens. "I'm a kitchen servant, nothing more." "Tell that to your face, every time his name comes up," Marta said, not unkindly, and left it there. Elena did not sleep well that night, turning Marta's words over in her mind, alongside the growing weight of something she could no longer pretend she did not feel. She thought of Corwin's cold rejection in the great hall, of her father's refusal to meet her eyes as he handed her over like a debt to be settled, of the healer's quiet, damning conclusions about her body and her worth. She thought of all the reasons why whatever was growing between herself and Damien could only end in more of the same pain, dressed up in finer clothing. And still, when she closed her eyes, it was not Corwin's cold face or her father's turned back that filled her thoughts. It was winter-gray eyes and a voice that said her name like it mattered, like she was a whole person rather than a broken one, and try as she might, Elena could not make herself wish that feeling away. She did not yet know that Lady Marisol had already begun making plans of her own, plans that would soon force everything Elena had tried so carefully to keep hidden out into the open, in front of the entire court, with nowhere left to hide. Marisol found her in the linen storage room 3 days after Marta's warning, and there was nothing accidental about the encounter at all. Elena was folding towels when the door opened without a knock, and Lady Marisol stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. Up close, she was even more striking than Elena had realized from a distance, tall and composed, dressed in fine wool, dyed a deep burgundy, that no kitchen servant could ever afford. Her dark red hair was pulled into an elegant braid, and her eyes, sharp and assessing, moved over Elena from head to toe in a single unhurried sweep. "So this is the kitchen girl," Marisol said, her voice pleasant in a way that did not quite reach her eyes. I expected someone more remarkable, given how much of the Alpha's attention you've managed to claim. Elena kept her hands steady on the towel she was folding, though her heart had begun to beat faster. I don't know what you mean, my lady. I work in the kitchens. I have very little to do with the Alpha's attention. Don't insult me by pretending, Marisol said, stepping further into the small room. I have eyes throughout this castle, and every one of them tells me the same story. Garden meetings, walks near the well, conversations that last far longer than a servant delivering water should require. She tilted her head, studying Elena with the cold curiosity of someone examining an insect that had wandered somewhere it did not belong. I want to know what you think you're doing. I'm not doing anything, Elena said, and this time, there was a thread of steel in her voice that surprised even herself. The Alpha speaks to me sometimes. I don't seek it out. I have never once asked for his attention, and I have no plans to. And yet you don't discourage it either. Marisol's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. Let me explain something to you, since you seem new to how things work in a place like this. I have spent 3 years positioning myself to become Luna of Frostmoor. My family has poured resources into this alliance. The council favors me. Every logical path leads to the same outcome, and I will not allow some nameless servant from the south to complicate that, simply because the Alpha finds her a novelty. Elena set down the towel she had been folding, meeting Marisol's gaze directly despite every instinct urging her to look away. I never claimed to be anything other than what I am, my lady. If the Alpha chooses to speak with me, that is his choice, not mine to control or refuse. I have no power in this castle. I have no family name, no wealth, no alliance to offer him. Whatever you fear I might take from you, I promise you, I have neither the means nor the intention to take it. For a moment, something flickered across Marisol's composed expression, something that might have been surprise at Elena's steadiness. It vanished quickly, replaced by the same cold assessment as before. See that it stays that way, Marisol said finally, moving toward the door. She paused with her hand on the handle, glancing back over her shoulder. For your own sake, kitchen girl, novelties fade, and when they do, the Alpha will remember exactly where you belong. It would be wise for you to remember it yourself, before someone reminds you in a far less pleasant fashion. She left without waiting for a response, the door clicking shut behind her, and Elena stood alone in the small storage room, her hands trembling now that there was no one left to see it. She told herself Marisol's warning changed nothing. She had already decided, hadn't she, that whatever existed between herself and Damien could go nowhere, that hoping for more would only lead to the same pain she had already survived once. And yet the encounter left a hollow, unsettled feeling in her chest that followed her through the rest of the day's work, through the evening meal, through the long hours of the night when sleep refused to come easily. The following morning, Elena threw herself into her work with a determination that Greta noticed but did not question, grateful, perhaps, for the extra pair of hands during the castle's busiest week of the season. A visiting delegation from a southern pack had arrived for trade negotiations, and the kitchens were stretched thin preparing meals for dozens of additional guests. Elena barely had a moment to think of anything beyond the next dish, the next tray, the next task Greta called out across the crowded room. It was during this chaos, 3 days after Marisol's visit, that Elena found herself once again climbing the stairs to the northern tower, this time carrying a tray meant for the visiting delegation's private meeting with Damien and his council. She had hoped to simply leave the tray at the door as instructed and return quickly to the kitchens, avoiding any private conversation that might draw further attention. The door opened before she could knock, but it was not Damien standing there this time. It was one of the visiting delegates, an older man with graying hair and sharp, assessing eyes, not unlike Marisol's had been. He looked at Elena, then at the tray, then back to her face with open curiosity. "You're new," he said, taking the tray from her hands without ceremony. "I don't recognize you from previous visits." "I've only been here a few months, my lord," Elena said, keeping her eyes lowered in the way she had learned was expected. Behind him, through the open door, she caught a glimpse of the meeting room, a long table surrounded by council members and visiting dignitaries, and at the head of it, Damien, his expression carefully neutral in the way she imagined a leader learned to wear during difficult negotiations. His eyes found hers for just a moment, a brief flicker of warmth breaking through the composed mask, before the older delegate stepped fully into the doorway, blocking the view. A few months, the delegate repeated thoughtfully, and already trusted to carry trays into private council meetings. Interesting. He said it lightly, but there was something calculating beneath the words that made Elena's stomach tighten with unease. I should return to the kitchens, my lord, she said, dipping her head and stepping back before he could ask her anything further. She hurried down the stairs, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the exertion of the climb, and did not slow her pace until she reached the safety of the busy kitchen once more. The delegation remained at Frostmore for another 5 days, and during that time, Elena did her best to avoid any task that might bring her near the northern tower or the meeting halls, where negotiations continued late into each evening. She told herself this was simply caution, the sensible choice given Marisol's warning, and the strange interest the visiting delegate had shown. She did not examine too closely the disappointment that settled in her chest each night, when she realized she had not seen Damien at all that day. On the 6th day, with the delegation finally departed and the castle beginning to settle back into its usual rhythm, Elena was sent to deliver a message to the head groundskeeper regarding herbs needed for an upcoming feast. The errand took her through a part of the castle grounds she rarely visited, a quiet path along the eastern wall that overlooked the mountains beyond. She found Damien there, alone, leaning against the stone wall and looking out at the distant peaks with an expression of deep exhaustion that made him look, for a moment, far younger than the powerful Alpha King the entire Northern Territory feared and respected. Long week? Elena asked before she could stop herself, drawn toward him, despite every warning Marisol had given her. He turned, and the tired lines of his face softened immediately at the sight of her. You have no idea. 5 days of negotiations, 3 separate proposals for potential mates disguised as trade discussions, and enough political maneuvering to make my head ache well into next month. He offered a faint smile. I missed our conversations. I looked for you more than once, but you seemed determined to stay hidden in the kitchens. Elena hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Lady Marisol paid me a visit, she said finally, deciding honesty was safer than pretense. She made it clear that my continued proximity to you was unwelcome. Something hardened in Damien's expression, the exhaustion giving way to something sharper. She had no right to threaten you. She didn't threaten me exactly, Elena said carefully. She simply reminded me of my place, which, to be fair to her, is not an unreasonable thing to do. I am a kitchen servant. She is a noblewoman being considered for the position of Luna. The imbalance is not something either of us invented. The imbalance, Damien repeated, his voice quiet but firm, exists because of a system I have never agreed with, not because it reflects anything true about your worth, or hers, or anyone else's. He pushed away from the wall, closing some of the distance between them. Elena, I need you to understand something. I have spent months meeting women my council believes would make suitable matches. Daughters of powerful families, women with impressive bloodlines and impeccable manners. Every one of them, exactly the kind of match tradition demands. And not one of them has made me feel the way a single conversation with you does. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Damien, you don't know anything about me. Not really. Not the parts that matter. Then tell me, he said, his eyes steady on hers, patient in a way that made her chest ache. Whatever it is you're afraid to say, tell me, and let me decide for myself whether it changes anything. For a moment, Elena almost did. The words rose in her throat, the truth about the healers, about her father's cold dismissal, about Corwin calling her broken in front of the entire hall. But the fear was still too strong, the memory of that humiliation too raw, and she found herself pulling back instead, retreating behind the same careful walls she had built since her arrival. I can't, she said quietly. Not yet. Please don't ask me to. Something in Damien's expression shifted, disappointment mixed with understanding, but he did not push further. Then I won't ask, he said. But know this, Elena, whatever you're carrying, whatever you're so afraid, will change how I see you. I don't think it will, and when you're ready to tell me, I'll still be here. He reached out, briefly, and brushed his fingers against hers, a small gesture that sent warmth spreading through her entire body despite the cold mountain air. Then he stepped back, offering her space, and Elena understood that he was giving her exactly what she needed most, the freedom to choose her own timing, without pressure, without demand. She returned to the kitchens that evening with her heart in turmoil, torn between the growing certainty that Damien's feelings for her were genuine and the equally strong fear that Marisol's warning had not been an idle threat. She did not yet know how right that fear would prove to be, or how soon the truth she had been so carefully guarding would be dragged into the light, not by her own choice, but by someone determined to see her humiliated and cast aside before it could grow into anything more. The summons came without warning, delivered by a stone-faced guard who appeared in the kitchen doorway just as the evening meal service was winding down. "The head cook's new girl," the guard said, scanning the room until his eyes landed on Elena. "Elena, you're to come with me. Lady Marisol has requested your presence in the great hall." The kitchen went quiet around her. Greta looked up sharply from the pot she was stirring, her expression tightening with concern. "For what purpose?" she asked, stepping forward with the protective instinct of someone who had grown fond of a member of her staff, without quite admitting it to herself. "I wasn't given a reason," the guard said, "only an order." Elena's stomach dropped, but she untied her apron with steady hands, refusing to let her fear show. Whatever Marisol wanted, hiding from it would only make things worse. "I'll go," she said quietly, and followed the guard out of the warm kitchen and into the cold stone corridors that led toward the great hall. The sound reached her before she arrived, the low murmur of a crowd gathered for something more than a routine evening. When she stepped through the tall doors, Elena understood immediately why. The hall was full. Nobles and council members and visiting guests arranged along the long tables, candlelight flickering across dozens of curious faces that all turned toward her the moment she entered. At the head of the room, seated in his customary place, Damien's expression shifted from mild confusion to sharp alertness the instant he saw her. Marisol stood near the center of the hall, dressed in deep green silk, a triumphant gleam in her eyes that made Elena's blood run cold before a single word had been spoken. "Ah, here she is," Marisol announced, her voice carrying easily across the hushed room. "The Alpha's favorite kitchen servant. I thought it only fair that the entire court finally meet the woman who has captured so much of our Alpha's attention these past months." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Elena forced herself to stand tall, though every instinct urged her to flee back through the doors and disappear into the safety of the kitchens. "Marisol!" Damien's voice cut through the murmurs, low and warning. "Whatever this is, end it now." "Patience, my lord." Marisol did not so much as glance in his direction, her attention fixed entirely on Elena. "I simply thought the court deserved to know exactly who they're dealing with. You see, I made some inquiries. It turns out our kitchen girl has quite an interesting history." She let the pause stretch, savoring the tension building in the room. "She wasn't sent here as a servant by choice. She was traded, handed over to settle a family debt, like livestock passed from one owner to another." The whispers grew louder. Elena's face burned, humiliation crawling up her neck, but she kept her spine straight and her eyes forward, refusing to give Marisol the satisfaction of watching her crumble. "And do you know why her own family was so eager to be rid of her?" Marisol continued, her voice sharpening now, cruelty slipping through the polished surface. The healers examined her, confirmed what her own mate apparently already suspected. She cannot bear children. Not now, not ever. Her own pack rejected her for it. Her own intended mate called her broken, in front of his entire hall, before shipping her north like unwanted cargo. Marisol turned finally to face Damien directly, her expression triumphant. "This is who has been stealing hours of your time, my lord. A woman with nothing to offer this pack. No bloodline, no future heirs, no value beyond what she can chop and stir in a kitchen." The silence that followed was worse than the whispers had been. Elena felt every eye in the room upon her, felt the old familiar shame rising up exactly as it had in her father's hall months earlier, exactly as it had when Corwin looked at her like she was already less than human. She wanted, more than anything, to simply disappear. But then she looked up, and she found Damien's eyes already on her, and what she saw there was not disgust, not disappointment, not the cold dismissal she had braced herself for. It was fury, sharp and immediate, though not directed at her. He rose from his seat, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. "Is that all?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm, though Elena could hear the barely contained anger beneath it. "You gathered the entire court, disrupted an evening meal, and humiliated a woman in front of everyone she works alongside, to tell me something I already knew? The triumph on Marisol's face faltered. You knew? Not the specific details, Damien admitted, stepping down from the raised platform where his seat stood, moving toward Elena with slow, deliberate steps that drew every eye in the hall along with him. Elena chose not to share her past with me, and I respected that choice, because it was hers to make, not mine to demand. But I have never once needed to know the details of a person's history to understand their worth in the present. He stopped beside Elena, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that his presence alone steadied the trembling in her hands. What I know is this. In the month since Elena arrived at Frostmoor, I have watched her work harder than almost anyone in this castle, without complaint, without seeking favor, without ever once trying to use whatever attention I offered her, to gain advantage over anyone else. I have spoken with her more honestly than I have spoken with any noble candidate paraded before me by this council, and not once, in all that time, has she asked me for anything at all. He turned to face the gathered crowd fully now, his voice rising with quiet, controlled authority that filled every corner of the hall. You want to know what I think of bloodlines and heirs, and all the calculations this court seems so obsessed with. I think a pack's strength has never truly come from how many pups are born beneath a full moon. It comes from loyalty, from honesty, from people willing to stand and work and build something real, rather than simply inherit a title they did nothing to earn. His gaze swept across the room, lingering pointedly on several council members, who shifted uncomfortably under the weight of it. I have watched this council bring me candidate after candidate, each one selected purely for the strength of her bloodline, as though a mate were nothing more than breeding stock, to secure the future of this pack. I find that view small. I find it beneath what I believe this pack is capable of becoming. Marisol's composure had cracked entirely now, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation, as the tables turned so completely against her. My lord, surely you cannot mean to suggest that a mate who cannot provide heirs is a suitable choice for Alpha King. The future of Frostmoor depends on... The future of Frostmoor, Damien interrupted, his voice hard now, depends on the choices I make as its alpha, not on the outdated assumptions this council continues to cling to despite my repeated objections. There are other paths to securing a pack's future beyond biological children. Adoption exists. Alliance exists. Chosen heirs, raised and trained by parents who love them regardless of blood, have led packs successfully for generations, before ours became so fixated on this narrow definition of what family must look like. He looked back at Elena, and his expression softened completely, all the fury melting away into something far gentler. But more than any of that, I refuse to build my future on a calculation, rather than a genuine connection. I would rather spend my life beside someone I trust and respect, and genuinely care for, than beside someone chosen purely for her bloodline, who I feel nothing for beyond polite obligation. The hall had gone utterly silent now, every noble and council member watching the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and undisguised fascination. Elena stood frozen beside Damien, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the room must be able to hear it, hardly daring to believe what she was witnessing. Damien turned to her fully now, ignoring the crowd entirely, as though the two of them were once again standing alone in the garden, or beside the eastern wall overlooking the mountains. Elena, he said quietly, though his voice still carried in the silent hall. I owe you an apology. You should never have had to hear your own history spoken aloud like a weapon, in front of strangers, without your consent. I'm sorry that happened to you tonight, and I promise you, it will not happen again, while I have any power to prevent it. Tears burned at the back of Elena's eyes, but for the first time in months, they were not tears of shame. You don't need to apologize, she managed. None of this is your fault. Perhaps not, Damien said, but I can still make it right. He turned back to the gathered court, raising his voice once more. Let me be clear. To everyone in this hall, and to anyone who carries word of tonight beyond these walls, Elena is not a broken woman to be pitied or dismissed. She is not defined by what her body can or cannot do. She has more courage, and more genuine kindness, than half the nobles currently seated at these tables, and I will not tolerate her being treated as anything less than she deserves within these walls. His eyes swept the room one final time, daring anyone to challenge him. This conversation is finished. Marisol, you and I will speak privately tomorrow, regarding tonight's conduct. For now, this hall is closed. The crowd began to disperse slowly, murmuring amongst themselves, though none dared speak loudly enough for Damien to hear. Marisol remained rooted in place for a long moment, her face a mixture of fury and disbelief, before finally turning and sweeping from the hall, with as much dignity as she could salvage. When the room had finally emptied, leaving only Elena and Damien standing together in the flickering candlelight, Elena finally allowed the tears she had been holding back to fall freely. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have told you myself, before she had the chance to." "Don't apologize," Damien said gently, reaching up to brush a tear from her cheek, with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "You were protecting yourself, Elena. You had every right to keep your own story on your own terms. None of what happened tonight is your fault. It's mine, for not seeing sooner how much danger Marisol's jealousy posed to you." "What happens now?" Elena asked, still trying to steady her breathing, still trying to fully absorb everything that had just unfolded in front of the entire court. Damien took her hand, his fingers warm and steady around hers. "Now," he said, "I face my counsel, and I make them understand, once and for all, that my choice in this matter has already been made, whether they approve of it or not." Elena searched his eyes, hardly daring to hope she understood him correctly. "Damien, what are you saying?" "I'm saying," he replied, lifting her hand gently to press a soft kiss against her knuckles, "that I have spent months pretending our conversations were simple friendship, when both of us have known, for quite some time now, that they were always something far more than that. I'm done pretending, Elena. Tonight proved I no longer have any reason to." For the first time since the healers had delivered their damning verdict, since her father had turned his back on her in the great hall of her childhood home, since Corwin had called her broken and walked away without looking back, Elena allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that perhaps her story was not over. Perhaps it was only just beginning. But even as hope bloomed warm and fragile in her chest, she understood that the hardest battle still lay ahead. The council would not surrender their traditions easily, and Marisol, humiliated and furious, was unlikely to simply disappear from Frostmoor, without one final attempt to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. The council chamber doors slammed shut, with a force that echoed through the stone corridor, and Elena, waiting anxiously outside, flinched at the sound. It had been 3 days since the incident in the Great Hall, 3 days of whispered conversations following her through every corridor of the castle, 3 days of stolen glances from nobles who now knew exactly who she was, and exactly what her body could not do. Greta had shielded her as much as possible, keeping her busy in the kitchens, away from the worst of the gossip, but nothing could fully protect her from the weight of an entire court's judgment pressing down on her from every direction. Now Damien stood behind those heavy doors, facing his full council for the first time since declaring his intentions in front of the entire hall, and Elena had no way of knowing what was being said, only that the raised voices reaching her through the thick wood did not sound promising. "He cannot be serious," came one voice, muffled, but still recognizable as Alden, the eldest council member, a man whose family had advised Frostmoor Alphas for 3 generations. "A kitchen servant, my lord, traded away by her own family. This is not a matter of personal preference. This concerns the future stability of this entire pack." "I am well aware of what it concerns," Damien's voice cut through, steady and unyielding, "which is precisely why I called this meeting. I want every objection laid out plainly, so we can address each one directly, rather than allowing them to fester as rumor and gossip throughout the castle." "Very well." Alden's voice again, sharper now. "She cannot bear children. That alone disqualifies her from consideration as Luna, regardless of any personal feelings you may have developed. Every pack in the Northern Territories measures strength, partly through the promise of continued bloodlines. If you choose a mate who cannot provide heirs, you weaken Frostmoor's standing in the eyes of every allied pack we depend on. Then let me ask you something, Alden." Damien's voice remained level, but Elena could hear the edge beneath it now. "How many of our current alliances were built on bloodline alone, without regard for the character or capability of the individuals involved? And how many of those alliances have proven fragile the moment convenience shifted in another direction?" I would rather build Frostmore's future on genuine loyalty and trust than on a calculation of biological potential that guarantees nothing about the strength or wisdom of the child eventually born from it. Another voice joined the argument, one Elena did not recognize, likely a younger council member less certain of his position than Alden. My lord, there are precedents for heirs, chosen through means other than direct birth, adoption within the pack structure, formal alliance with a trusted bloodline, even fostering a promising pup from an allied family. These paths exist. They are simply uncommon. Uncommon does not mean impossible, Damien said. And I would remind this council that Frostmore itself was founded 3 generations ago by an alpha who broke with tradition in far more dramatic fashion than I am proposing now. If we are so committed to honoring the legacy of our founders, perhaps we ought to honor their willingness to challenge convention when convention no longer served the people it was meant to protect. The argument continued for what felt like an eternity to Elena, waiting alone in the cold corridor, her hands twisted together in her lap. She caught fragments through the door, voices rising and falling. Alden's persistent objections met again and again by Damien's calm, unwavering resolve. She heard her own name spoken more than once, always with the same careful distance the council seemed to maintain toward anyone they considered beneath serious political consideration. And each time it happened, she had to fight the urge to simply walk away, to spare herself the pain of being discussed like an obstacle, rather than a person. Finally, after what felt like hours, the chamber doors opened, and council members began filing out, their expressions ranging from grim resignation to open displeasure. Alden was among the last to leave, and he paused when he saw Elena waiting in the corridor, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "You've caused quite a disruption in this castle, young woman," he said finally, his voice neither warm nor entirely hostile. "I never intended to disrupt anything, my lord," Elena said carefully. "I only wanted to work, and to build a quiet life here. Whatever has grown between myself and the Alpha was never something I sought out or planned." Alden studied her for a long moment longer, something shifting slightly in his expression. "Perhaps not," he said finally. "But you should know, the objections raised today were not born entirely from cruelty. Some of us have watched this pack weather difficult seasons, and we worry, genuinely, about its future stability. It is easy to speak of loyalty and character when times are peaceful. It is harder to remember those values when a pack faces true crisis and finds itself without the alliances that bloodline connections often provide. I understand the concern," Elena said honestly. "I would feel the same, in your position. But I hope, in time, I might prove that a person's worth to this pack can be measured in more than bloodlines and alliances." Something almost like respect flickered across Alden's weathered face before he nodded once, curtly, and continued on his way down the corridor. Elena entered the council chamber to find Damien alone, seated at the long table, his head bowed slightly, exhaustion evident in every line of his posture. He looked up when she entered, and despite the visible weariness, his expression brightened immediately at the sight of her. "That sounded difficult," she said softly, moving to sit beside him. "It was," he admitted. "Alden and the more traditional members of the council are not going to simply accept this decision, no matter how many arguments I make. They'll continue pushing, continue searching for ways to convince me otherwise, or worse, find ways to undermine you directly. Then perhaps you should reconsider," Elena said quietly, though the words tasted bitter even as she spoke them. "Damien, I don't want to be the reason your pack fractures from within. I don't want your council at war with you because of me." Damien reached for her hand, holding it firmly. "Elena, listen to me. This council has resisted nearly every meaningful change I've tried to implement since taking on this title. They resisted my efforts to open trade with the Eastern Territories. They resisted my decision to reform how disputes are settled within the pack. They will resist almost anything that challenges the comfortable traditions they've grown accustomed to, regardless of whether that resistance actually serves the pack's best interests. This is not a new pattern. It is simply the most personal version of it I've faced yet." "That doesn't make it easier," Elena said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. But it does mean this isn't truly about you, Elena, not in the way it might feel. It's about a council clinging to a version of tradition that no longer reflects what I believe this pack needs to become." You happen to be the person who has finally forced that conflict into the open, but the conflict itself has been building for years. Elena considered this, some of the weight in her chest easing slightly at his words. What happens now? Now, Damien said, I continue making my case, as many times as necessary, until the council either accepts my decision or accepts that I intend to make it, regardless of their approval. As Alpha, the final choice belongs to me, not to them. They know this, even if they don't like it. And Marisol? Elena asked, unable to keep the concern from her voice. She isn't going to simply accept defeat quietly. Damien's expression darkened slightly. No, I don't imagine she will. I've already sent word to her family regarding her conduct in the Great Hall. It was a serious breach of respect, both toward you and toward this pack's dignity, exposing private information in such a public and cruel manner. There will be consequences for that, regardless of how this situation with you and I ultimately resolves. Elena nodded, though a small knot of worry remained lodged in her chest. She had seen the look in Marisol's eyes as she stormed from the hall 3 nights earlier, and something told her a woman that determined, that used to getting exactly what she wanted, would not simply retreat and accept a formal reprimand as the end of the matter. She was right to worry. 2 days later, as Elena made her way back to the servants' quarters after a long evening in the kitchens, she found a folded note tucked beneath her door, no signature attached, the handwriting elegant and unfamiliar. You may have won his attention for now, the note read, but attention fades, and traditions do not bend so easily as one impulsive alpha might wish. There are those within this council, and beyond it, who will not allow a barren servant to sit upon the Luna's seat, whatever declarations are made in a moment of foolish passion. Enjoy this while it lasts. It will not last long. Elena read the note twice, her hands trembling slightly, before folding it carefully and tucking it into the pocket of her apron. She considered, for a long moment, whether to bring it to Damien immediately, or to keep it to herself and avoid adding further strain to an already difficult situation. In the end, she decided he deserved to know. Whatever threats Marisol or her allies intended to make, hiding them would only leave Elena more vulnerable, not less. She would face this challenge honestly, the same way she had faced every other difficulty since the healers first delivered their verdict months earlier. But as she made her way toward the northern tower that night, the note heavy in her pocket, Elena could not shake the growing sense that the true test of everything Damien had promised her, everything he claimed to believe about worth and loyalty and love beyond bloodlines, was still to come. Marisol's warning had made one thing painfully clear. This fight was far from over, and the next move, whatever it turned out to be, would not come from a place of fairness or honor. The fire alarm bell rang out across Frostmoor just past midnight, jolting Elena awake before she had even registered the smell of smoke drifting beneath her door. She scrambled out of bed, pulling on her boots with shaking hands, her heart already pounding, as she rushed into the corridor, to find other servants doing the same. Confusion and fear evident on every face in the dim torchlight. Somewhere in the castle, someone was shouting orders, directing people toward the courtyard, and Elena followed the flow of the crowd, her mind racing through possibilities of what could have caused such chaos in the dead of night. Outside in the cold courtyard, she found Greta counting heads among the kitchen staff, relief washing over the older woman's face when she spotted Elena among the gathered crowd. "Thank the moon," Greta muttered, pulling Elena briefly into a tight embrace before releasing her just as quickly, embarrassed by the show of affection. The storage room near the eastern wing caught fire. They think it started in the herb stores, though no one's sure yet how. Elena's stomach twisted uncomfortably. The eastern wing storage room sat directly beneath the corridor leading to the servants' quarters, close enough that a fire left unchecked could have spread with devastating speed. "Is everyone accounted for?" she asked. "We're still counting," Greta said grimly. "The guards are searching now." It was nearly an hour before the fire was fully contained, the smoke finally clearing enough for the castle's residents to be allowed back inside, though the eastern storage room itself had been destroyed entirely, along with a significant portion of the kitchen's preserved supplies for the coming winter months. Elena stood in the courtyard long after most of the crowd had dispersed, watching the guards move through the wreckage with grim, methodical focus, and felt a cold certainty settle over her that this had been no accident. She was proven right the following morning, when Damien summoned her to his study, with an expression more serious than she had ever seen on his face. The fire was deliberate, he told her without preamble, closing the door behind her. The guards found evidence of oil poured along the storage room walls, far too much, and too deliberately placed to have occurred naturally. Someone set that fire intentionally. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. You think it was connected to me, to Marisol's warning? I think it's an extremely dangerous coincidence if it wasn't, Damien said grimly. The storage room sits directly beneath the corridor to the servants' quarters, Elena. If that fire had spread even slightly faster, or if the alarm had been raised even a few minutes later, the consequences could have been far worse than damaged supplies. Do you have proof it was her? Elena asked, though even as she said it, she understood how unlikely proof would be. Marisol was too clever, too experienced in the careful politics of court life, to leave obvious evidence pointing back to herself. Not yet, Damien admitted, but I've already sent guards to secure her chambers and question her directly. If she's responsible for this, I intend to find out, and there will be consequences far more serious than a formal reprimand from her family. The investigation that followed consumed the castle for days. Guards questioned every servant who had been near the eastern wing that night, searched the grounds for any additional evidence, interviewed Marisol and her attendants at length. Elena found herself unable to fully settle back into her usual work, jumping at unexpected sounds, watching shadows in corridors with a wariness she had not felt since her earliest, most uncertain days at Frostmoor. It was Owen, the dry-humored kitchen servant who had befriended Elena early in her time at the castle, who finally uncovered the piece of evidence that broke the case open. He had noticed, during the chaos of the fire, one of Marisol's personal attendants, moving through the eastern corridor, at an hour when she had no legitimate reason to be there, carrying a small oil lamp far larger than necessary for simply lighting her own path. When questioned directly by Damien himself, the attendant, young, and clearly terrified of the consequences she now faced, confessed everything. Marisol had ordered her to set the fire, intending only to damage the servants' quarters enough to frighten Elena into leaving Frostmoor voluntarily, believing the threat of continued danger would succeed where her earlier warnings had failed. The attendant swore Marisol had never intended anyone to be seriously harmed, only sufficiently frightened, though the reckless placement of the fire so close to occupied living quarters told a different story than the one Marisol apparently wished to believe about her own intentions. The council chamber was full again the following evening, this time for a very different kind of judgment than the one that had unfolded weeks earlier. Marisol stood before the assembled council, and Damien himself, her usual composure entirely gone, replaced by a rigid, frightened defiance that did little to hide the fear beneath it. I never meant for anyone to be truly hurt, she said, her voice tight. I only wanted her frightened enough to leave, to understand that Frostmoor was never meant to be her home. You endangered dozens of servants who had nothing to do with your grievance against Elena, Damien said, his voice cold in a way Elena had never heard from him before. You risked lives, Marisol, over a personal vendetta rooted in wounded pride. That is not a mistake I can simply overlook, regardless of your family's standing or the alliance your bloodline represents. The council, even Alden, offered no defense of Marisol's actions this time. Whatever traditional loyalties or political considerations might have once inclined them toward her cause, the reckless endangerment of pack members within their own castle walls crossed a line none of them were willing to excuse. In the end, Damien's judgment was formal exile, Marisol stripped of any future claim to consideration as Luna, and sent back to her family's territory, with a clear message that Frostmoor would tolerate no further interference in matters the Alpha considered settled. As Marisol was escorted from the chamber, her face pale and stricken, she paused briefly, near where Elena stood watching the proceedings. For a moment, something almost like genuine regret flickered across her features. I hope you understand, Marisol said quietly, though there was no real warmth in the words, only a kind of hollow resignation. This was never truly about you as a person. It was about everything I believed I was owed, and everything I feared losing. That doesn't excuse what I did, but I wanted you to know it, regardless. Elena did not respond immediately, considering the words carefully before finally speaking. I hope you find, wherever you go next, something worth building that doesn't depend on someone else losing everything for you to have it. Marisol said nothing further, simply nodding once, before allowing the guards to lead her from the chamber and, ultimately, from Frostmoor entirely. That night, with the immediate danger finally resolved, and the castle beginning to settle back into a fragile sense of normalcy, Damien found Elena in the quiet garden, where their strange, unlikely bond had first truly begun to grow months earlier. He found her seated on the low stone bench near the herb beds, staring up at the clear night sky, the weight of the past weeks visible in the tired set of her shoulders. "It's over," he said softly, sitting beside her. "Marisol is gone. The council, whatever their remaining reservations, understands now that this decision is not one I intend to reconsider." "I keep waiting for the next threat," Elena admitted quietly. "It feels strange, sitting here without that fear pressing down on me." "Give it time," Damien said gently, reaching for her hand. "The fear will fade, eventually. I intend to make certain of it." He turned to face her more fully, something serious and tender in his expression that made Elena's breath catch. "Elena, I've spent these past difficult weeks more certain than ever of what I want, despite everything that's tried to stand in the way of it. I don't want to simply continue as we have been, careful and quiet, waiting for the next challenge to force our hand. I want to claim you formally, before this entire pack, as my chosen mate, not because tradition demands it, and not despite what tradition says should disqualify you, but because I have never once doubted, from the very first night you brought that tray of cold food to my study, that you were exactly the person I wanted beside me." Tears gathered in Elena's eyes, though this time they carried none of the old shame, only overwhelming warmth. "Damien, are you certain, truly certain? This will not become easier simply because Marisol is gone. There will be other challenges, other voices questioning whether I'm truly worthy of standing beside you." "I am certain," Damien said, without a single trace of hesitation. "More certain than I have been of anything since taking on this title. Elena, I don't need a bloodline promise to know what kind of partner you would be. I've watched you work harder than almost anyone in this castle, without complaint, without seeking advantage. I've watched you face humiliation and threats, with more courage than most warriors I've trained beside. I've watched you offer kindness, even to the woman who tried to burn down half this castle to be rid of you. Whatever challenges remain ahead of us, I would rather face every single one of them with you beside me, than face an easier path with someone who could never understand what real strength looks like." Elena reached up, cupping his face gently in her hands, hardly able to believe how completely her life had transformed since that cold, humiliating night in her father's hall. So many months, and so many miles behind her now. "Then yes," she whispered. "Whatever comes next, I want to face it with you." Damien leaned forward, closing the small remaining distance between them, and kissed her softly beneath the wide, star-scattered sky, sealing a promise that no council objection, no jealous rival, and no old wound from her past would ever again have the power to undo. The following morning, word spread through Frostmoor, with the speed such news always seemed to travel within castle walls. The Alpha King had formally chosen his mate, and preparations for a claiming ceremony, one that would soon transform a rejected, traded-away kitchen servant into the future Luna of the strongest pack in the Northern Territories, began without delay. The great hall of Frostmoor had never looked so full, and Elena stood just outside its towering doors, with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Weeks of preparation had led to this single morning, weeks in which Greta had insisted on personally overseeing every detail of Elena's appearance, weeks in which Damien had continued meeting with his council, slowly winning over even the most reluctant voices, through sheer patient persistence. Weeks in which Elena herself had wondered, more than once in the quiet hours before dawn, whether she truly belonged in the role she was about to step into. "You look ready," Greta said now, adjusting the deep blue fabric of Elena's gown one final time. Her sharp eyes softened with something that looked suspiciously like pride. "You've earned this moment as much as anyone ever has." "I don't feel ready," Elena admitted quietly. "I keep thinking about everyone in that hall who still doubts whether I belong there." "Let them doubt," Greta said firmly. "Doubt fades quickly once people see the truth standing in front of them. And the truth, Elena, is that you've worked harder in this castle than half the nobles who'll be watching you today. You've earned every bit of respect you're about to receive, whether or not it comes easily at first." Marta appeared beside them then, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I still remember your first week here," she said, laughing softly despite the emotion in her voice. You barely knew how to hold a kitchen knife properly. Now look at you." Elena managed a small, trembling smile, grateful beyond words for the friendships that had carried her through the hardest months of her life. Friendships she never could have imagined forming when she first arrived at Frostmoor, as nothing more than traded cargo, stripped of her old name and her old worth. The heavy doors finally opened, and the hall beyond fell into hushed silence as Elena stepped through them, every eye in the crowded room turning toward her at once. She found Damien waiting at the far end of the hall, standing before the assembled council and nobility, dressed in formal ceremonial clothing that made him look every bit the powerful alpha king his reputation suggested, though the warmth in his eyes, as he watched her approach, remained exactly the same as it had been in that quiet garden, in that late-night study, in every stolen moment they had shared since her arrival months earlier. Elena walked the length of the hall slowly, her eyes fixed on Damien, doing her best to ignore the weight of every gaze upon her. She passed rows of nobles she recognized from whispered gossip and formal dinners, past council members whose expressions ranged from cautious acceptance to genuine warmth, past servants and staff who had gathered along the edges of the hall, granted permission to witness a ceremony that, in tradition, would normally have excluded them entirely. When she finally reached the front of the hall, Damien took her hands in his, and the warmth of his touch steadied the last of her trembling nerves. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, though his eyes remained fixed only on her, as if the two of them were entirely alone despite the crowd surrounding them. "Months ago, you arrived at Frostmoor, believing your worth had already been decided by others, that your value had been measured and found lacking by people who never truly understood what real strength looks like. I want the entire pack to hear, today, exactly how wrong that judgment was." He turned slightly, addressing the gathered court now, though his hands remained firmly around hers. "I have spent my entire time as Alpha listening to arguments about bloodlines, about the necessity of biological heirs, about traditions that value a person's worth based purely on what they can produce, rather than who they actually are. Today, I reject that narrow view, fully and permanently. Elena has shown this pack more courage, more genuine kindness, and more quiet strength in her short time here than most people demonstrate across an entire lifetime. She has earned her place beside me, not through bloodline or political alliance, but through everything she has proven herself to be." Alden stepped forward from among the council members, and for a moment, Elena's chest tightened with old fear, bracing for one final objection. Instead, the elderly councilman inclined his head respectfully toward her, something like genuine warmth finally reaching his weathered features. "On behalf of this council," Alden said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "we formally recognize Elena as chosen mate to Alpha Damien Frost and future Luna of Frostmoor Pack." He paused, glancing toward Damien with something that might have been reluctant admiration. "It took considerable persuasion to arrive at this recognition, I'll admit, but watching how this young woman has conducted herself through every trial placed before her these past months, I find myself, somewhat to my own surprise, genuinely satisfied with the outcome." A murmur of approval rippled through the hall, and Elena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, tears of relief and overwhelming gratitude that she no longer needed to fight so hard to hold back. The formal ceremony continued, ancient words spoken beneath the watchful eyes of the entire assembled court, words that bound Elena and Damien together not through the promise of future children or political advantage, but through mutual choice, freely made and publicly declared. When Damien finally placed the ceremonial mark upon her, sealing their bond before the entire pack, a great cheer rose through the hall, servants and nobles alike joining together, in celebration of a union that had defied nearly every expectation anyone had held when Elena first arrived at Frostmoor, as nothing more than an unwanted trade. The celebration continued long into the evening, feasting and music filling the great hall, in a way Elena had never witnessed during her months working quietly in the kitchens below. She found herself pulled into conversation after conversation, nobles who had once dismissed her now offering genuine, if somewhat cautious, congratulations, servants she had worked alongside for months, beaming with open pride at her transformation from fellow kitchen staff to future Luna. Late in the evening, as the celebration began winding down, Elena slipped away briefly to the quiet garden where so much of her story with Damien had first taken root. She sat on the familiar stone bench, breathing in the cool night air, allowing herself a rare moment of quiet reflection amid the whirlwind of the day. She thought of her father, turning his back on her in that cold great hall so many months earlier, and found, to her own surprise, that the memory no longer carried the same sharp pain it once had. She thought of Corwin's cruel dismissal, calling her broken before an entire hall of witnesses, and found that too had lost much of its power over her, replaced instead by a quiet, growing certainty of her own worth that no one's judgment could easily undo again. She thought, too, of the future stretching out ahead of her, uncertain in many ways, but filled now with genuine hope rather than the hollow resignation she had carried with her on that long, cold journey north months earlier. Damien had already spoken, in quiet, private conversations over recent weeks, about the paths available to them for securing Frostmore's future beyond the traditional expectation of biological heirs. There were children within the pack who had lost parents to illness or conflict, children who might benefit from a stable, loving home. There were allied families whose own children might one day be fostered and trained as future leaders, raised with genuine care rather than mere political calculation. Nothing had been decided yet, but Elena found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely excited rather than anxious about what lay ahead. "There you are," Damien said softly, finding her in the quiet garden, just as he had found her there so many times before. He settled beside her on the familiar stone bench, taking her hand in his. "I wondered if you might have slipped away to find a moment's peace." "I needed to breathe," Elena admitted, leaning against his shoulder. "Today has been a great deal to absorb." "A great deal of good, I hope," Damien said, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "The best kind of overwhelming," Elena confirmed, smiling up at him. "I keep thinking about how far I've come from that night in my father's hall. I never imagined, not for a single moment, that my story would lead me here." "Neither did I imagine it," Damien admitted, "though I'm endlessly grateful it did. Whatever brought you to Frostmore, Elena, I will never regret the trade that placed you within these walls, even knowing the pain it caused you to arrive here." He tightened his hold on her hand slightly. "Whatever challenges still lie ahead of us, and I don't doubt there will be more, I face them gladly, knowing you'll be standing beside me through every one of them." Elena looked up at the clear night sky above Frostmore, the same stars that had witnessed her arrival months earlier, as a broken, discarded woman, with nothing left to lose, now witnessing her transformation into something she never could have imagined for herself, a woman chosen not despite her flaws, but simply and completely for who she truly was. "Whatever comes next," she said softly, echoing the promise she had made beneath these same stars weeks earlier, "I'm ready to face it. All of it. With you." Somewhere beyond the castle walls, the mountain stood silent and eternal beneath the winter sky, indifferent to the small, remarkable story unfolding within Frostmore's ancient stones. But within those walls, a woman once traded away as worthless had found, against every expectation the world had placed upon her, a home, a family, and a love built not on bloodlines or obligation, but on genuine choice, freely given and gratefully received. And as the last embers of the celebration fire burned low in the great hall behind them, Elena finally allowed herself to believe, completely and without reservation, that her story was no longer defined by everything she had lost. It was defined, instead, by everything she had finally found.